Have you ever noticed that peculiar contradiction? How the most gruesome torture device in history, the cross, has been transformed into the world's most ubiquitous religious symbol? It's one of those anomalies hiding in plain sight, so familiar we rarely pause to question it. Consider the strangeness. A method of execution so horrific that civilized Romans wouldn't subject their own citizens to it became the central icon of Western civilization. The instrument of Jesus' suffering hangs in churches, adorns necks, crowns buildings, and punctuates prayers. There's something almost suspicious about this fixation. Why would a religion supposedly built on love become obsessively centered around an instrument of torture and death? The contradiction extends beyond symbolism into theological emphasis. Christianity doesn't merely acknowledge the crucifixion as historical event, but places it at the very center of its narrative, returning to it constantly, depicting it graphically, emphasizing its most painful aspects. Look how he suffered for you becomes the emotional cornerstone of the faith. From elaborate Good Friday rituals to graphic cinematic recreations, the religion seems determined to keep the torture of its founder perpetually present in the minds of believers. There's something curious about this pattern, a suspicious preoccupation that warrants deeper investigation. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently the crucifixion is connected to believers' psychological state. He died for your sins. His blood washes you clean. By his wounds you are healed. These aren't random theological statements, but follow a systematic pattern. The suffering of Jesus is consistently framed as response to the believer's moral condition, creating a direct psychological link between his pain and your worthiness. There's something almost too convenient about the psychological function of this framing. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if the emphasis on the crucifixion isn't primarily about historical remembrance or theological truth, but about psychological control? What if the constant focus on Jesus' suffering serves not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable? What if the cross isn't primarily a symbol of divine love, but a sophisticated instrument of psychological manipulation, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Western religious psychology, challenging our most basic assumptions about Christianity's emotional foundation. If the crucifixion narrative functions primarily as a tool of psychological control rather than expression of divine love, how might this distort believers' relationship to themselves, to others, and to the divine? What might become possible if we distinguished between Jesus' actual suffering and its instrumental use by religious authorities? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious belief? A philosopher whose father and grandfathers were Lutheran pastors, giving him intimate knowledge of Christian psychology from the inside. A thinker whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific religious doctrines, but the psychological mechanisms by which they establish and maintain power. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion lurks something much less divine, a sophisticated system of psychological control operating through the weaponization of guilt. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to question the psychological function of the crucifixion narrative? Could it be that entire religious systems have benefited from keeping these functions hidden? What if the ultimate liberation isn't rejecting Jesus, but recognizing how his suffering has been instrumentalized to create psychological submission? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about Christianity, guilt, and religious psychology. They offer a perspective on the crucifixion not as expression of divine love, but as sophisticated instrument of psychological control, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in how Christianity presents the crucifixion that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between Jesus' suffering and believers' psychological state, between his pain and their moral worth, between his torture and their salvation. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how the crucifixion narrative creates a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. Consider how the crucifixion is framed in Christian teachings. He died for your sins, immediately establishing a causal link between your moral failures and his suffering. By his stripes, you are healed, creating direct correlation between his pain and your salvation. He bore the punishment you deserved, explicitly transferring your guilt to his body. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The crucifixion is systematically presented not merely as historical event, but as moral transaction in which Jesus suffers specifically because of your sins and specifically for your benefit, creating a debt that can never be fully repaid. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse Christian traditions. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. The crucifixion creates a form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted to Jesus, and by extension, to the church claiming to represent him. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in religious practice. From Catholic penitence to Protestant altar calls, Christian traditions consistently return believers to the foot of the cross, reminding them of Jesus' suffering on their behalf, reinforcing the connection between his pain and their moral condition. The emotional centerpiece remains the same. You are responsible for his suffering. You benefit from his pain. You owe a debt that can never be fully repaid. The pattern continues. Religious practice reinforces the psychological link between Jesus' suffering and believers' moral worth. The anomaly extends beyond theology and ritual into visual representation. Christian art throughout history has emphasized the graphic details of the crucifixion, the crown of thorns, the nails, the spear, the blood, creating visceral emotional impact that reinforces the psychological connection between Jesus' pain and believers' moral state. Whether in medieval paintings, church sculptures, or modern films like The Passion of the Christ, the pattern repeats. The suffering of Jesus is depicted in ways that maximize emotional impact and reinforce moral indebtedness. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge its psychological function. We discuss the crucifixion's historical details, theological meanings, and spiritual significance at length, but we seldom examine how consistently it creates a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how perfectly the crucifixion narrative serves to establish and maintain psychological control over believers. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that the crucifixion narrative might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if Christianity's emphasis on Jesus' suffering isn't primarily about historical remembrance or theological truth, but about establishing a particular form of moral indebtedness that makes believers perpetually controllable? What if the cross isn't primarily a symbol of divine love, but a sophisticated instrument of psychological manipulation, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religious psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether Christianity's most sacred symbol might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between the crucifixion and psychological control? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if the cross isn't raised as symbol of love, but as instrument of control? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. The cross is not a symbol of love. It is the perfect moral whip. In the winter of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most controversial works, On the Genealogy of Morals. At 43, he was at the height of his philosophical powers, though still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His books sold poorly, sometimes fewer than 100 copies, and he lived in near isolation in various European locations as his meager pension allowed. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. It was within this context of physical suffering and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most penetrating insights about the psychological function of the crucifixion narrative. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine religious psychology. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers, also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian teaching from the inside. He was raised in an environment where the crucifixion was central, where Jesus' suffering was constantly presented as a response to human sinfulness and source of salvation. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether the crucifixion narrative might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What made Nietzsche's perspective on the crucifixion especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey.
Here was a man who had been immersed in Christian teaching from childhood, yet possessed the rare intellectual courage to question its psychological foundations. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Might suffering serve purposes quite different from those explicitly acknowledged? Could pain be instrumentalized as tool of power rather than expression of love? During his periods of
relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. The cross isn't merely symbol of divine love, but sophisticated instrument of psychological control, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis that Christianity had transformed Jesus' suffering from historical event into psychological weapon, a tool that operates by creating emotional debt that can never be fully repaid. As he would later write in The Antichrist, Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, failed. It has made an ideal out of opposition to the survival instinct of strong life. This wasn't mere rhetorical flourish, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project, the creation of particular moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to constrain natural human vitality under the guise of spiritual salvation. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how Christian teaching actually functions in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently the crucifixion narrative creates a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological function of Christianity's central symbol, not primarily expression of divine love, but sophisticated instrument of moral control. It was this recognition of the hidden psychological function of the crucifixion narrative that gave Nietzsche's religious critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting Christian teaching as false, he was uncovering what he saw as its hidden psychological purpose: not salvation, but subjugation; not liberation, but control. As he would later write in Twilight of the Idols, Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in another or better life. This wasn't mere polemic, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project: the creation of moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to constrain natural human vitality under the guise of spiritual salvation. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how the crucifixion functions psychologically. It wasn't merely a critique of specific theological claims, but a profound insight into how religious narratives establish and maintain psychological control. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of Christianity, guilt, and the relationship between religious narrative and psychological control? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of Christian texts and teachings. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how the crucifixion was presented across Christian tradition. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic transformation of Jesus' suffering from historical event into psychological weapon, a tool that operates by creating emotional debt that can never be fully repaid. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern: Christianity's stroke of genius. God himself sacrifices himself for the guilt of mankind. God himself makes payment to himself. God as the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the crucifixion narrative creates a particular form of indebtedness that is structurally impossible to discharge, a debt so profound that not even God could forgive it without payment, yet so vast that only God himself could make sufficient payment. This creates perfect conditions for perpetual psychological control. The believer is caught in eternal moral debt that can never be fully repaid, no matter how obedient, how penitent, how devoted they become. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function, how it systematically creates moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control over believers. The crucifixion narrative doesn't just inspire gratitude. It instills a particular form of indebtedness that makes believers perpetually controllable through moral emotions they cannot fully discharge. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christian teaching frames the relationship between Jesus' suffering and human sinfulness.
From Paul's letters with their emphasis on salvation through Christ's blood, to medieval penitential practices, to modern evangelical altar calls, Christian tradition consistently presents the crucifixion as response to the believer's moral condition. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Jesus' suffering is systematically presented as caused by your sins and undertaken for your benefit, creating moral debt that can never be fully repaid. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how the crucifixion functions in religious practice. He noted how consistently Christian rituals return believers to the foot of the cross, reminding them of Jesus' suffering on their behalf, reinforcing the connection between his pain and their moral condition. Whether through Catholic Mass with its emphasis on Christ's sacrifice or Protestant communion services with their focus on broken body and shed blood, the pattern continued. Religious practice reinforces the psychological link between Jesus' suffering and believers' moral indebtedness. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how the crucifixion narrative creates a particular psychological profile in believers. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Christianity is the still unexhausted curse on mankind. Christianity, the most fatal kind of self-presumption ever." This isn't mere polemic, but recognition of how the crucifixion narrative creates complex moral emotions, not just guilt, but particular form of indebtedness that can never be fully discharged, making believers perpetually subject to moral control. The pattern was consistent. The psychological impact of the crucifixion isn't primarily gratitude, but guilt that becomes foundation for ongoing control. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. As he writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't mere provocation, but recognition that the crucifixion narrative functions psychologically to create moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to constrain natural human vitality under the guise of spiritual salvation. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance,
but the consistent pattern across Christian texts, teachings, and practices. The same correlation appears again and again. The crucifixion is systematically presented in ways that create particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the psychological impact of the crucifixion narrative wasn't merely incidental, but essential to Christianity's operation as system of moral control. The specific theological details might change across Christian traditions, but the basic psychological pattern remained consistent. The crucifixion creates moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control over believers through creation of debt that can never be fully discharged. In The Antichrist, published posthumously in 1895 but written in 1888, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. What is more harmful than any vice? Active sympathy for the ill-constituted and weak, Christianity. This deceptively simple statement reveals his understanding that Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion operates psychologically, not primarily to inspire compassion, but to create particular moral framework in which natural human vitality becomes cause for guilt. Jesus' suffering becomes the standard against which believers are perpetually judged and found wanting, creating moral emotions that serve to constrain rather than enhance human potential. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological mechanism wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in the lived experience of believers. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "He who fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster in the process. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." This enigmatic statement points to his understanding that the crucifixion narrative doesn't just create temporary emotional impact, but shapes believers' entire psychological orientation, creating moral framework in which natural human vitality becomes source of guilt, natural impulses become cause for shame, natural power becomes reason for self-suspicion. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how Christianity functions psychologically, not primarily to enhance human potential, but to constrain it through creation of moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control. By teaching people that Jesus suffered because of their sins and for their benefit, Christianity creates internal psychological division where none previously existed, transforming natural human vitality into source of guilt, natural impulses into cause for shame, natural power into reason for self-suspicion. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that the crucifixion serves as psychological weapon rather than merely historical event or theological symbol. As he writes in The Antichrist, the concept God, invented as counter-concept to life, everything harmful, poisonous, slanderous, the whole deadly hostility to life synthesized in this concept in a gruesome unity. This isn't mere rhetorical excess, but profound psychological insight. The crucified God serves as perfect instrument of psychological control, precisely because it transforms natural human vitality into cause for eternal guilt that can never be fully discharged. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion functions psychologically not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. The cross isn't merely symbol of divine love, but sophisticated instrument of psychological manipulation, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological power of Christianity lies precisely in its ability to transform Jesus' historical suffering into instrument of ongoing moral control. As he writes in On the Genealogy of Morals, Christianity is the most fatal kind of self-presumption ever. This isn't mere polemic, but recognition that the crucifixion narrative creates complex moral emotions, not just guilt, but particular form of indebtedness that can never be fully discharged, making believers perpetually subject to control through moral emotions they cannot fully resolve. What implications might this understanding have for our relationship to Christianity, guilt, and the psychological impact of religious narratives. And what might it reveal about the possibility of spiritual approach that enhances rather than constrains human potential? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion: that Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily as expression of divine love, but as sophisticated instrument of psychological control. That the cross isn't raised as symbol of salvation, but as tool of moral subjugation. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of Christian teaching and practice. The psychological impact of the crucifixion narrative wasn't isolated to particular doctrines or rituals, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout Christianity's approach to moral formation. The pattern was clear. The crucifixion creates moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control over believers. Not through external coercion, but through sophisticated psychological mechanisms that operate by creating debt that can never be fully discharged. On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. The principal moral concept, guilt, Schuld, derives its origin from the very material concept of debt, Schulden. Have these genealogists of morality ever remotely dreamt that, for instance, the major moral concept, guilt, Schuld, derives its origin from the very material concept of debts, Schulden? This passage reveals his recognition that Christianity's moral framework operates fundamentally through creation of psychological debt. Debt created most powerfully through the crucifixion narrative, which presents Jesus' suffering as both caused by your sins and undertaken for your benefit, creating double bind of moral indebtedness that can never be fully resolved. The pattern revealed itself in how Christianity approaches sin and forgiveness. Rather than presenting forgiveness as simple release from moral failure, Christian teaching consistently returns believers to the crucifixion as the necessary precondition for forgiveness. By his blood we are cleansed. Through his wounds we are healed. By his stripes we are made whole. The pattern continued. Forgiveness itself becomes vehicle for reinforcing moral indebtedness, reminding believers that their cleansing came at terrible price they can never fully repay. In Christian approaches to moral formation, the same pattern appeared. Rather than presenting virtue as natural human flourishing, Christian ethics consistently frames moral development in relation to Christ's sacrifice, taking up your cross, crucifying the flesh, dying to self. The pattern persisted. Moral growth itself becomes a continuous reminder of the debt created by the crucifixion, reinforcing psychological control through moral emotions that cannot be fully discharged. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in Christian conceptions of salvation. Rather than presenting salvation as natural human fulfillment, Christian teaching consistently portrays it as response to the crucifixion, saved by his blood, redeemed by his sacrifice, justified by his death. The pattern repeated. Even salvation itself becomes vehicle for reinforcing moral indebtedness, reminding believers that their redemption came at cost they can never adequately repay. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian teaching and practice. Whether in approaches to sin, conceptions of virtue, or understandings of salvation, the same psychological mechanism operated. The crucifixion creates moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control over believers through creation of debt that can never be fully discharged. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in another or better life. This isn't mere polemic, but recognition of how Christianity systematically transforms natural human vitality into source of guilt through the psychological weapon of the crucifixion narrative. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights: that Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily as expression of divine love, but as sophisticated instrument of psychological control. The cross isn't merely symbol of salvation, but tool of moral subjugation, perfect mechanism for creating guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. Jesus' suffering isn't just remembered, but weaponized, transformed from historical event into psychological instrument that operates by creating moral emotions that serve to constrain rather than enhance human potential. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable? What if the cross isn't primarily symbol of divine love, but sophisticated instrument of psychological manipulation, perhaps the most effective tool of moral subjugation ever devised? What if Jesus' suffering has been transformed from historical event into psychological weapon that operates by creating debt that can never be fully repaid? This recognition wasn't merely academic observation, but profound challenge to how we understand Christianity, guilt, and the relationship between religious narrative and psychological control. If the crucifixion narrative functions primarily as instrument of psychological manipulation rather than expression of divine love, what might become possible if we distinguish between Jesus' actual suffering and its instrumental use by religious authorities? What form of spirituality might emerge beyond the moral debt created by the weaponization of the cross? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious criticism into the very heart of Western moral psychology. If Christianity's emphasis on the crucifixion serves not primarily to inspire gratitude, but to instill a particular form of guilt that makes believers perpetually indebted and therefore controllable, then addressing this pattern requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of our relationship to guilt, indebtedness, and the psychological impact of religious narratives. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of traditional morality, including the guilt created by the crucifixion narrative. The lion represents the courage to say no to these imposed moral emotions, creating space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for establishing relationship to life beyond the moral indebtedness created by traditional religious narratives. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the psychological impact of the crucifixion requires not just theological reinterpretation, but fundamental transformation of how we relate to guilt, indebtedness, and the moral emotions created by religious narratives. The first profound implication is psychological. If the crucifixion narrative functions primarily to create moral emotions that establish and maintain control, authentic spiritual development requires psychological liberation from these mechanisms of control. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound psychological insight. Even after theological beliefs fade, the moral emotions created by religious narratives often persist, continuing to shape human psychology through guilt and indebtedness long after their theological foundations have been questioned. The second implication is ethical. If Christian morality operates fundamentally through creation of psychological debt, authentic ethical development requires establishing relationship to goodness beyond the foundation of moral indebtedness. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, what is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that authentic moral development might emerge not from guilt created by the crucifixion narrative, but from natural human capacity for compassion and creativity. Not from moral debt, but from moral abundance, not from psychological constraint, but from vital expression. The third implication is spiritual. If Christianity has weaponized Jesus' suffering as instrument of psychological control, authentic spiritual development might require distinguishing between his actual teaching and its institutional instrumentalization. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, what is the meaning of the antithetical concepts God and man? Everything related to the concepts God, immortality, redemption, beyond, negates intelligence, negates life, negates nature, negates the world. This isn't mere rejection of spirituality, but but recognition that authentic spiritual life might emerge beyond the moral indebtedness created by traditional religious narratives, not through guilt, but through affirmation, not through debt, but through creative abundance. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If the crucifixion has been transformed from historical event into psychological weapon, human flourishing requires liberation from the moral emotions it has been used to create. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I love him who wants to create beyond himself, and thus perishes. This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that authentic human development might emerge beyond the moral indebtedness created by the crucifixion narrative. Not through perpetual guilt, but through creative affirmation. Not through endless debt, but through genuine responsibility. Not through moral constraint, but through vital expression. What does this mean for our relationship to Christianity, guilt, and the psychological impact of religious narratives? If the crucifixion narrative functions primarily as instrument of psychological control rather than expression of divine love, what might become possible if we distinguished between Jesus' actual suffering and its institutional weaponization? What form of spirituality might emerge beyond the moral debt created by the instrumentalization of the cross? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic spiritual development begins not with more perfect theological understanding of the crucifixion, but with psychological liberation from the moral emotions it has been used to create. The freedom from Christianity's psychological mechanisms might open possibilities for relationship to life that neither traditional believers nor critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging beyond the moral indebtedness created by the weaponization of Jesus' suffering. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific theological details into what might be called a conspiracy of guilt, a collective cultural agreement to transform Jesus' historical suffering into ongoing psychological weapon. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the effectiveness of guilt as mechanism of social control. The crucifixion provides perfect vehicle for creating moral emotions that establish and maintain power precisely because it combines maximum emotional impact with minimum possibility of discharge, creating debt that can never be fully repaid. On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Christianity. What began as historical event gradually transformed into sophisticated psychological instrument that operates by creating moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control over believers. The specific theological details changed across Christian history, but the basic psychological mechanism remained consistent. The crucifixion creates debt that can never be fully discharged, making believers perpetually subject to control through moral emotions they cannot fully resolve. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the effectiveness of guilt as mechanism of social control. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, Christianity is Platonism for the people. This isn't mere philosophical observation, but recognition that Christianity evolved as a sophisticated system for managing human psychology through creation of moral emotions that serve specific social functions, particularly the establishment and maintenance of control through guilt that cannot be fully discharged. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of Western culture. Religious institutions use the crucifixion to create moral indebtedness. Educational systems often perpetuate the psychological patterns established by this moral framework. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce rather than challenge the internal divisions created by Christianity's moral emotions. Each domain develops its own language, but the basic psychological mechanism often remains consistent. The creation of moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control. The conspiracy extends into how we conceptualize moral development itself, often framing it as response to guilt rather than expression of natural human capacity for compassion and creativity. It appears in how we approach psychological healing, frequently focusing on management of guilt rather than cultivation of vital affirmation. It emerges in how we understand spirituality, commonly defining it in relation to moral emotions rather than creative expression. The pattern persists. The psychological mechanisms established by the crucifixion narrative continue to shape Western moral psychology, even in seemingly secular contexts. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse cultural contexts. As traditional Christian theology loses cultural authority in certain contexts, the same basic psychological mechanism often continues through secular forms: the management of guilt without theological language, the creation of moral indebtedness without explicit reference to the crucifixion, the establishment of control through moral emotions without religious framework. Different conceptual details, same basic psychological mechanism: the creation of guilt that serves to establish and maintain control. This recognition reveals something profound about Western moral psychology, that it often continues the same basic patterns of guilt and indebtedness even as the specific theological content evolves. The person managing secular guilt is often engaged in essentially the same psychological dynamic as the person managing religious guilt, responding to moral emotions that serve to establish and maintain control through creation of debt that can never be fully discharged. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that Christianity weaponized the crucifixion, but that this psychological pattern persists even as specific theological content evolves. That behind diverse approaches to moral development often lurks the same basic psychological mechanism: the creation of moral emotions, especially guilt, that serve to establish and maintain control through debt that can never be fully discharged. The real conspiracy isn't specific theological content, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming Jesus' historical suffering into psychological weapon that operates across generations and contexts. This pattern raises profound questions about moral psychology, cultural evolution, and the possibility of human flourishing beyond the mechanisms of control established by the crucifixion narrative. If we've been collectively engaged in weaponizing Jesus' suffering as instrument of psychological control, what might become possible if we consciously distinguished between his actual teaching and its institutional instrumentalization? What form of moral development might emerge beyond the foundation of guilt created by the crucifixion narrative? Why has the psychological function of the crucifixion narrative remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on Western moral psychology? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the appearance that Christianity operates primarily through love rather than guilt. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but the very psychological mechanisms by which Christianity establishes and maintains power, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional religious narratives. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few psychological mechanisms are more useful for establishing and maintaining control than the guilt created by the crucifixion narrative. By maintaining the appearance that Christianity operates primarily through love rather than guilt, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that Jesus' suffering has been weaponized as instrument of psychological control. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that the crucifixion represents divine love rather than sophisticated instrument of moral control. The Church's authority depends fundamentally on its claim to represent divine love, rather than to manipulate through guilt, to liberate believers rather than to control them through moral emotions they cannot fully resolve. Acknowledging the psychological function of the crucifixion narrative would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific theological details, but the very basis of religious moral authority. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that Christianity operates primarily through love rather than guilt. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying the crucifixion as expression of divine love rather than instrument of psychological control. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present Jesus' suffering as motivated by compassion rather than weaponized as tool of power, as liberation rather than subjugation, as expression of love rather than instrument of control. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that Christianity operates primarily through love rather than guilt. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that the crucifixion represents divine love rather than sophisticated instrument of moral control. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, what is the meaning of the antithetical concepts, God and man? Everything related to the concepts God, immortality, redemption, beyond, negates intelligence, negates life, negates nature, negates the world. This insight reveals how moral education might serve not just to transmit specific ethical content, but to maintain the appearance that Christianity operates primarily through love rather than guilt, that the crucifixion represents divine compassion rather than sophisticated instrument of psychological control. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly Western moral psychology has been shaped by the guilt created by the crucifixion narrative. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of guilt they cannot fully discharge to the more demanding terrain of moral development beyond the foundation of indebtedness created by traditional religious narratives. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting moral narratives over disturbing psychological insights, for guilt that seems redemptive over freedom that seems terrifying, and for moral emotions that can be managed within familiar frameworks over psychological liberation that would require fundamental reconsideration of how we approach guilt, indebtedness, and the relationship between religious narratives and psychological control. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound psychological insight. Even after theological beliefs fade, the moral emotions created by religious narratives often persist, continuing to shape human psychology through guilt and indebtedness long after their theological foundations have been questioned. What does this mean for the possibility of moral development beyond the guilt created by the crucifixion narrative? If we've been collectively engaged in weaponizing Jesus' suffering as instrument of psychological control, what might become possible if we consciously distinguish between his actual teaching and its institutional instrumentalization? What form of spirituality might emerge beyond the foundation of moral indebtedness created by the weaponization of the cross? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of human flourishing beyond the psychological mechanisms established by the crucifixion narrative, not through rejection of Jesus, but through liberation from the weaponization of his suffering, not through abandonment of ethics, but through moral development beyond the foundation of guilt, not through denial of spirituality, but through relationship to life beyond the debt created by the instrumentalization of the cross. The final question isn't whether Jesus suffered, but whether his suffering should continue to function as instrument of psychological control. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about Western moral psychology, how thoroughly the crucifixion narrative has shaped our relationship to guilt, indebtedness, and moral development. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of human flourishing beyond the psychological mechanisms established by the weaponization of the cross, not through rejection of Jesus, but through liberation from the instrumental use of his suffering. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the overman, not a superior being in the crude biological sense, but a way of relating to life beyond the moral emotions created by traditional religious narratives. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that authentic moral development might emerge beyond the foundation of guilt created by the crucifixion narrative, not through perpetual indebtedness, but through creative responsibility, not through moral constraint, but through vital expression, not through psychological control, but through genuine freedom. This isn't about embracing cruelty or indifference, but transforming how we understand moral development itself, recognizing that authentic ethical life might emerge not from the guilt created by the crucifixion narrative, but from natural human capacity for compassion and creativity. Perhaps the truly moral person isn't one perpetually indebted by Jesus' suffering, but one who expresses natural human potential for care and creation without the mediating control of weaponized guilt. One who acts ethically not from moral debt, but from vital abundance, not from fear of punishment, but from love of life. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to the crucifixion narrative, noticing when it functions not to inspire gratitude, but to create guilt that makes you perpetually indebted and therefore controllable. It means asking whether your conception of goodness emerges from genuine compassion or from moral emotions designed to establish and maintain control. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "Jesus died for your sins," or "He suffered because of you," not to express theological truth, but to create psychological debt that can never be fully discharged. It means developing relationship to Jesus beyond the weaponization of his suffering, distinguishing between his actual teaching and its institutional instrumentalization. It means approaching spirituality not through perpetual moral debt, but through genuine responsibility, not through eternal guilt, but through present creativity, not through psychological constraint, but through vital expression. It means recognizing the possibility of ethical life beyond the foundation of indebtedness created by the crucifixion narrative. Morality motivated not by guilt, but by natural human capacity for compassion and creativity. Most importantly, it means understanding that liberation from the psychological mechanisms established by the weaponization of the cross doesn't require rejection of Jesus himself. That authentic engagement with his teaching might emerge precisely through distinguishing between his actual message and its instrumental use by religious authorities. This isn't abandonment of spirituality, but its transformation. Relationship to life beyond the debt created by the crucifixion narrative. The path forward isn't about rejecting Jesus, but liberating his message from its weaponization as instrument of psychological control. Whether within traditional Christian frameworks or beyond them, authentic spiritual development requires distinguishing between Jesus' actual teaching and its institutional instrumentalization, between his historical suffering and its weaponization as tool of moral control, between his message of liberation and its transformation into instrument of psychological subjugation. What might become possible if you distinguished between Jesus' actual teaching and the guilt created by the weaponization of his suffering? What form of moral development might emerge beyond the foundation of indebtedness created by the crucifixion narrative? What relationship to life might you discover beyond the psychological mechanisms established by the instrumental use of the cross? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect theological understanding of the crucifixion, but from psychological liberation from its weaponization as instrument of control. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic engagement with Jesus might begin precisely where Christianity's instrumental use of his suffering ends, with recognition that the cross is not a symbol of love. It is the perfect moral whip. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that Jesus didn't suffer, but that his suffering has been transformed from historical event into psychological weapon, and that human flourishing requires liberation from the moral emotions created by this weaponization. The real journey isn't understanding the crucifixion more perfectly, but recognizing how thoroughly it has been instrumentalized as tool of psychological control, and discovering what might become possible when we relate to life beyond the guilt created by the weaponization of Jesus' suffering. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that the Church doesn't keep the cross raised out of memory, but out of interest.